Good evening. I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, November 24th. And we begin tonight with a new climate adaptation strategy that the federal government has released. It includes $1.6 billion in new spending. The strategy is aimed at helping communities faced with risks that range from extreme heat and wildfires to floods and storms. Emergency Preparedness Minister Bill Blair made the announcement in Prince Edward Island. This is where Hurricane Fiona caused widespread damage earlier this fall. The federal funding mostly tops up existing programs and won't cover the costs of major projects. Moving to Ottawa now, where the Emergencies Act inquiry continued today with testimony from the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister. Chrystia Freeland says the economic threat to Canada escalated exponentially when Freedom Convoy protesters blocked a key trade hub between the U.S. and Canada. She says Canada was being hurt by the thousands of protesters who descended on Ottawa in late January, and after already weathering multiple economic blows beforehand. But she says the threat reached new levels when protesters blocked cross-border traffic on the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Ontario. Ms. Freeland says she was in direct contact with U.S. President Joe Biden's office about the blockade of the busiest trade route between the two countries. Well, in economic news, Canada's job vacancy rate increased to 5.7% in September from 5.4% in August. Statistics Canada says the number of job vacancies for the month rose to 994,800. Now, this is up 3.8% from the previous month. The federal agency says the increase was largely attributable to seasonal variations, as job vacancies typically peak in September. All right, well, meanwhile, the former Bank of Canada governor has a warning about the impact of interest rates. Stephen Pallaz says the impact of higher interest rates will be more powerful than people are expecting. Mr. Pallaz warns that the Canadian economy is more sensitive to interest rates than it was 10 years ago. He told an Ottawa conference that international contributors to inflation are already dissipating, and he predicts the annual inflation rate will fall to about 4% on its own. But Mr. Pallaz says policy action will need to do the rest of the work to get inflation back down to the central bank's 2% target. All right, moving to Western Canada now, where Alberta's Justice Minister is calling on the Trudeau government to fire the head of the RCMP. Tyler Shandro is urging Federal Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino to immediately dismiss Commissioner Brenda Lucki. He says Alberta has lost confidence in her. Mr. Shandro says Commissioner Lucki has failed to do her job on multiple files, and in response, Mr. Mendicino says that the government has confidence in the RCMP chief. Back in Ontario, ratification votes began today by 55,000 educational support workers. They are voting on the tentative contract agreement reached between the Canadian Union of Public Employees and the provincial government. The 4-year agreement contains an annual wage hike of 3.59% a year, and it averted a strike. But union officials were disappointed that it doesn't come with new staffing level guarantees. Results are expected to be announced on December 6th. All right, well, moving to another education-related development, this time on the East Coast. The Newfoundland and Labrador government has canceled public exams for high school students for the 2022 to 2023 school year. Public exams were first canceled as the result of schools being closed during the first wave of COVID-19 in 2020, and they were canceled over the next 2 years as well. Government says that the decision is part of an expanded review of the K-12 education system. They say that the public exam system, as it existed pre-COVID, may no longer meet the educational needs of students. Well, it looks like the Canadian Pediatric Society is no longer recommending firm time limits for screen use among toddlers and preschoolers. Instead, the Society is issuing new guidance, which encourages parents to prioritize educational, interactive, and age-appropriate materials. The doctors' group still urges no screens at all for kids younger than the age of 2, but a previous recommendation to limit 2 to 5-year-olds to 1 hour a day of screen time has been scrapped. Calgary pediatrician Dr. Janice Hurd says parents would do better to focus on reducing passive screen use, co-viewing with kids, and modeling desired behaviors. Well, the Grey Cup celebrations got underway in Toronto today. Mayor John Tory proclaimed today as Double Blue Day in honor of the Argos Grey Cup victory. The football team celebrated with a rally at Maple Leaf Square today after winning their 18th CFL championship. The Argos defeated the Blue Bombers 24-23. All right, stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with more top stories, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem is warning against broad measures to clamp down on high inflation. Mr. Macklem says governments should use well-targeted and temporary measures to provide inflation relief to Canadians. Bank of Canada officials faced questions from MPs on Wednesday about the central bank's policy decisions in the face of decades-high inflation. The central bank has raised interest rates 6 consecutive times so far this year. On the East Coast, an affordable energy advocate in Nova Scotia says the imposition of consumer carbon pricing is a good idea, but he says rising energy costs continue to pose problems for people with lower incomes. Affordable Energy Coalition Chair Brian Gifford says most people will be helped by the federal government's plan, which is to provide quarterly rebates to offset carbon pricing costs beginning in July. But Mr. Gifford says even more support is needed to help people, especially those on lower incomes. This with the switch from heating oil to electric heat pumps. Mr. Gifford says a $250 million federal grant announced Monday needs to be synchronized with existing provincial programs to be more effective. All right, moving to Saskatchewan now, where the provincial government has introduced changes to its trespassing legislation, and they're aimed at federal government employees. The amendment calls for federal workers to comply with a law that requires people to get permission from landowners to go on private property. Justice Minister Bronwyn Eyre says it follows complaints from agricultural producers, which were about federal employees testing water on private land for pesticides without consent. The legislation says failure to comply with the rules could lead to fines of up to $200,000. Turning to BC now, where the new premier is promising to spend $230 million over the next 3 years. This will be to hire 277 RCMP officers across the province. David Eby says the money will be used to fill vacancies in rural detachments and regional units. It will also be used to hire more officers for specialized units like major crime, the sexual exploitation of children unit, and money laundering. The money will also support prosecutors and probation officers dealing with violent, high-risk offenders. The 4 victims of a fatal head-on collision between a pickup truck and SUV in Ontario have been identified by police. Ontario Provincial Police say 42-year-old Jason Schmidt of Hastings, Ontario, was killed when the pickup truck he was driving collided with an SUV. The victims in the SUV were 18-year-old Riddick Hart, 46-year-old Jonathan McDonald, and 52-year-old Stephanie Hart. Police say a young female who was also a passenger in the SUV was transported to a Toronto area hospital with life-threatening injuries. Back in the West, Mounties have issued a warning after a North Vancouver man received a phone call from scammers claiming to have kidnapped his wife and demanding ransom. Police say during the call, which appeared to be coming from the woman's phone, a female voice could be heard in the background. Officers were able to locate the man's spouse and determine that the kidnapping was a hoax. He did not give the scammers any money. 2 people in Manitoba are being accused of bilking a charity ice fishing tournament out of some cold, hard cash. Winnipeg police say the proceeds of the Full Tilt Winter Walleye Tournament in early 2021 weren't donated to the Children's Hospital Foundation of Manitoba as promised. Police allege the event organizer and a second person kept the money for themselves. Christian Lillyman and Heather Newart are charged with theft, fraud, and money laundering after a complex and nearly year-long investigation. Ford is recalling over 634,000 SUVs worldwide. This is because a cracked fuel injector can spill fuel or leak vapors onto a hot engine and cause fires. The recall covers Bronco Sport and Escape SUVs from the 2020 through 23 model years with 1.5-liter 3-cylinder engines. But the Dearborn, Michigan automaker says it's not recommending that owners stop driving the vehicles or park them outdoors. That's because it says fires are rare and generally don't happen when the engines are off. Well, it looks like Halifax is home to a new art installation honoring Black Canadian civil rights activist Viola Desmond. Miss Desmond was arrested for watching a movie in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia in 1947 at a segregated movie theater. Her case helped start the civil rights movement in Canada, and she was posthumously pardoned for the arrest in 2010. Artist Marvin Nelligan created an art installation in Halifax that is a replica of the hair salon that Miss Desmond owned. Up next, we have Forum Daily's market update with Catherine Murray. The host of The Buck Stops Here will take us through the biggest moves in the markets and what she has been watching this week. So stay tuned. Forum Daily will be right back in a moment. Welcome back. It's now time for our weekly market update with Catherine Murray, host of The Buck Stops Here. Take it away, Catherine.
Thanks, Nima. Hello, everyone, and welcome to your weekly market recap. I'm Catherine Murray. Well, U.S. markets are closed for Thanksgiving. The TSX is open, but a bit of a quiet day. We did, however, see both U.S. and Canadian markets move higher Tuesday and Wednesday of this week. The key event, of course, being the FOMC minutes, which were released Wednesday at 2 o'clock, which indicated that most Fed members believed that they should slow the pace of tightening. However, some members also believe that the terminal interest rate, the interest rate at which they will stop raising rates, might be higher than previously thought. That would have been hawkish and you would think sent the markets down, but the market takeaway was that it was on the dovish side and markets moved higher, particularly the growth areas of the market. As it relates to what we're seeing here in Canada from a rate perspective, the Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem did indicate that we need to continue to raise rates in order to combat inflation. In other words, it doesn't seem as though the rate rises here in Canada are going to slow down anytime soon. He went on to say that if they had pulled back pandemic stimulus spending sooner, that would have limited the inflation effects that we're dealing with today. As we look closer at the markets, the TSX, as I mentioned, did move higher on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week, with most sectors higher as well, with particular strength in financials, materials, as well as industrials, where you saw the rails, aerospace, and transport move higher. We did, however, see some weakness in the real estate market and also energy. And WTI has seen some weakness as of late, trading below that $80 mark, down by about 3% or so. Canadian dollar, however, is moving a little bit higher versus the U.S. dollar, so some strength there. And stock-specific news here in Canada, I'd keep my eye on Alimentation Couche-Tard. They did come in with less than expected earnings results, less versus expectations, sending that stock down by about 2%. It's always interesting to keep your eye on some of the retail stocks within the marketplace to give us a read in terms of what's going on with the consumer and, of course, the effects that everyone's feeling on the inflation front. Away from that, as we look at the U.S. markets, stocks, as I mentioned, did move higher over the past couple of days. It seems as though the peak inflation narrative is what is driving those U.S. markets higher. In other words, investors believe that we are not going to see inflation move higher from where we currently see it, and therefore the U.S. Federal Reserve will, in fact, really slow down that pace. So that is the narrative in the United States. In terms of the big picture story, though, we're watching very mixed earnings results and also mixed economic data. On the economic data front, we did have both flash manufacturing and services come in below expectations and actually contracted. We also had initial jobless claims coming in higher than expected, so another negative there. However, home sales, new home sales, I should say, did beat expectations. So again, a bit of a mixed picture and a mixed reading. As it relates to the earnings results, Nordstrom's in the retail space, of course, did come in with better than expected results, but did highlight concerns surrounding margin and margin pressures, perhaps from some promotional activity within the retail space. You get higher promotional activity if retailers can't sell through their inventory. So they're just going to discount it, mark it down, get it off the books and out of the warehouses. That is not really a good sign for retail and does give you an indication in terms of perhaps the consumer slowing down. We also echoed those comments or sentiment from Guess, the retailer Guess. They did come in with a lower than expected results. However, as I mentioned, we do have a mixed picture as relates to earnings. Deere in the industrial sector did come in with better than expected results, setting that stock higher. And also, I should just point out, as it relates to some of the growth stocks, they got a bit of a boost, the sector from Tesla, which moved higher to the tune of 7%, following an upgrade over at Citibank. And just to put everything into perspective in terms of where we stand, we have had a nice rebound in November. But on a year-to-date basis, the Dow is still down 6%, TSX down by about 5%, the S&P down 15%, and the NASDAQ down 27%. But as I said, we are seeing a bit of a rebound in the last quarter of 2022, with the Dow up 19%, the S&P up 12%, and the NASDAQ up 6%. So all to say, we have seen some stability, some move higher, a lot of losses to recoup, and there's been a lot of damage underneath the surface. So you may have stocks down that are much more significantly than the broader markets. It will take some stability and some knowledge in terms of where we go from here on a rate perspective to kind of recoup, I think, some of those losses. Nima, I'll leave it there. Back to you.
All right, thanks for that, Catherine. Again, that was Catherine Murray, host of The Buck Stops Here. Stay with us. We've got more news from around the world coming up after a short break, so stay tuned. Forum Daily will be back. It is the fourth day of an urgent search after an earthquake in Indonesia. Rescuers have narrowed their work to a landslide where dozens are believed to be trapped. This comes after a magnitude 5.6 earthquake killed at least 271 people and injured over 2,000 others. More than a third of Monday's victims on Java province were children. Well, as the war in Ukraine continues, residents of Kyiv have switched to survival mode as food and water grows more and more scarce. New Russian missile strikes have plunged the city and much of the country into the dark. But despite the hardship, Ukrainians say that if Russian President Vladimir Putin's intention is to break them, then he should think again. Amid the ongoing Russian missile strikes in Ukraine, the World Health Organization is speaking out against strikes on healthcare facilities. European Director Dr. Hans Kluge says attacks on healthcare facilities are a clear breach of international law. Moving to the situation in Iran, as the UN Human Rights Council has voted to condemn the bloody crackdown on peaceful protesters. The council is calling for the creation of an independent fact-finding mission to investigate alleged abuses, and particularly those that are committed against women and children. Tehran's envoy at a special council meeting blasted the initiative as politically motivated. The protests were triggered by the death more than 2 months ago of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini while in the custody of Iran's morality police. After a bloody protest in China, the company that assembles Apple's iPhones has apologized for a pay dispute, which set off employee protests at a factory where virus controls have slowed production. Workers complained that the terms of wages were changed from what was offered. They walked out over complaints about unsafe conditions, while Foxconn blamed a technical error. Labor action is also taking place in the UK, where much of the country is strike-bound today in one of the biggest coordinated walkouts this year. Thousands of postal workers, university lecturers, and school teachers in the UK are going on strike. This is to demand better pay and working conditions amid the country's cost of living crisis. Moving across the channel to France now, where politicians in the lower house of parliament have begun debating a proposal which would enshrine abortion rights in the country's constitution. The lengthy and uncertain legislative battle was prompted by the rollback of abortion rights in the U.S., but it would need approval from majorities in the National Assembly and the upper house. Abortion in France was decriminalized under a key 1975 law, but there is nothing in the Constitution that guarantees abortion rights. In a disturbing trend, the number of domestic violence victims in Germany, mostly women, has increased by 3.4% in the last 5 years. The German government said Thursday there were almost 144,000 domestic violence cases just in 2021. This is up by over 4,700 from 2017. The real figures are likely much higher, since many victims are afraid to report domestic violence to the police. The report says about 80% of victims were female, while almost 79% of suspects were male. Sweden's central bank has followed other central banks in undertaking a big increase to its key interest rate to combat inflation. It said Thursday that high prices are undermining purchasing power, and it's making it tough for households and companies to plan their finances. It says the rate hike of 3/4 of a percentage point is meant to bring down inflation and safeguard the inflation target. All right, well, meanwhile, Turkey's central bank has continued its trend of taking different steps to fight inflation than its peers. It has delivered another large interest rate cut. This despite inflation running at more than 85%. The bank announced Thursday that it was lowering the rate by 1.5 percentage points to 9%. Now, that's in line with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's unorthodox economic views. He says high borrowing costs cause high inflation. This even though traditional economic thinking says raising interest rates helps to tame inflation. South of our border, people across the United States are marking their Thanksgiving holiday today, which is followed tomorrow by Black Friday. Black Friday appears to have overtaken Boxing Day as the biggest shopping event of the year on both sides of the border. Retail analysts expected shopping in brick-and-mortar stores to make a comeback this holiday season. Professional services firm JLL's survey of nearly 1,000 Canadians found 90% of respondents plan to spend time in shopping centers. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.